This is Louise Zimmer with another story from our pioneer past. In the winter of 1785, a young soldier, Joseph Buell, began a long journey from West Point. West Point at that time was a strong fortification on the strategically important plateau on the west bank of the Hudson River. Built in 1778, West Point had been General Washington's headquarters since 1779. But in that year of 1785, it was not yet the West Point we know, an academy for military training now. But that role was still about 7 years in the future back then, and for young Joe Buell and the soldiers gathered there, it was simply a gathering place for men bound for the far reaches of the frontier, that vast expanse of land west of the Ohio River. They had expected and had hoped to stay put there till spring, but on the 17th of November, Major John Willis arrived with, for them, bad news. "We're on our way, boys." When? Why, how about day after tomorrow? And so it was. They marched 10 miles that first day, spent the night in a barn, was up at daylight, on across New Jersey into Pennsylvania, doing about 10 miles a day pretty consistently, continuing to sleep in barns or taverns. And on one occasion, Joe recorded with great satisfaction that the hospitality at Hamden was nothing short of extraordinary. At Noel's Tavern they found plenty of room, good food, good grog, and girls. Well, they marched at daybreak anyway the next morning, and on November 22nd they arrived at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where the atmosphere was very, very different than the accommodations they had left behind at that jolly Noel's Tavern. Joe writes, "This town is elegant," and goes on to say, "The people who inhabit this town are Moravians. A curious sort of people. They display a good deal of goodness and honesty." Joe seems a bit surprised that such people really exist, and he continues with a sense of wonderment. "The town is the pleasantest situated I have ever seen, almost surrounded by a beautiful river, must have been the Delaware River, and the houses are large and magnificent. They have a large monastery and a nunnery where they instruct their young people, and they do not permit them to be absent at night on any pretense." We kind of get the impression Joe had checked this out, and maybe had discovered that part of the instructions to young Moravians, especially the girls, was to avoid all soldiers. He had done his research thoroughly, however, learning that they keep the males separate from the females, and will not permit them to even speak to one another without a tutor present. Their dress is very odd, but very clean and neat. He doesn't say anything about the food, only that they left the town at 5 in the morning, crossed a rope ferry, and arrived at Allentown, having covered 6 miles. They continued on from there another 10 miles, and put up for the night. At this camp, his buddy, Sergeant Levi Munsell, was obliged, now that was Joe's word, obliged, to cut a man's skull open who refused to obey him. As I said before, sympathy wasn't a large part of Joe's nature, and evidently not of Levi's either, and this is very obvious as he writes, "We thought the wound would be mortal, and indeed hoped so, but it was not." And so the journey and the journal continued. To Reading, Lebanon, crossing the Susquehanna to Carlisle, on to Big Springs, Shippensburg, Fort London, crossing the Tuscarawas Mountain, where he noted very disagreeable weather, the roads wet and slippery. And throughout his trek he records desertions, thefts, fights, floggings, and various troubles, mainly with men and or horses. Finally, on the 21st of December, after a full month on the road, the company arrived at Fort Pitt. It was high noon when they arrived, and Sergeant Buell recorded his first impression. "This place is an agreeable disappointment." "Huh? Say what, Joe? An agreeable disappointment?" Well, he goes on to explain. "Instead of finding ourselves in a wilderness, we are in a pleasant city, as to its appearance. But we soon observe this is a most extravagant, outrageous place where the worst man is considered the best fellow." So much for his opinion of Fort Pitt. He sums it up and dismisses it with this short, terse sentence: "We tarried here but 4 days, and were happier leaving it than finding it. On December 25th, the little army was on the move again. No mention is made of the holiday, nothing to indicate that it was of any significance to anyone. We crossed the Allegheny frontier this day, marched 10 miles into the wilderness and camped for the night. Made a large fire by the side of an oak tree. Heavy snow. Now, in reading journals and diaries of frontier travelers over the years, I've often noticed that they were up and on the move early, very early, like 3 a.m., and I often wondered why in the world would anyone get up in what I still consider the middle of the night to travel. But in researching the role of weather and other natural events in history, I stumbled upon the explanation. Those early travelers were taking advantage of the full moon. After all, their eyes weren't accustomed to the intensity of artificial light as ours are, so they could see perfectly well at 3 a.m. when the full moon rode high. And so Joe Buell, Levi Munsell, and their fellow soldiers got up, marched through the bright winter night into the day, arriving at Fort McIntosh at sunset. Went into the old barracks, he wrote, which were very bad without any floor or roofs. You may recall that Fort McIntosh had been the site of Indian treaties involving the Wyandot and Delaware not quite a year earlier, January 25th of that year, 1785. Makes one wonder why the fort was in such bad shape if it had been in use less than a year earlier, but whatever the reason for its disrepair, it was 7 years old after all, and maybe occupying it just long enough for a few days of treaty talks hadn't led to any substantial upkeep. Joe writes that we finished the year in repairing our barracks and making ourselves comfortable for the winter. Time passes away, but slow here. These troops are unacquainted with duty. The officers are very strict and seem to try to take every advantage, punishing the men for the smallest offense. This last complaint seems a little strange, coming from a man who hadn't hesitated to order all those severe floggings earlier in their journey. And we'll soon see that things get much worse before all those dark winter days turn toward spring and the resuming of their journey. Fort McIntosh was located at the mouth of Beaver Creek, which is about 30 miles northwest of Pittsburgh. It was still quite a distance to their destination, the mouth of the Muskingum, where another company of soldiers was busy building a new fort to be named for their commander, General Josiah Harmer. But for now, winter has brought almost all activity to a halt, and Joe Buell, his buddy Levi Munsell, and all the other fellows are dug in, so to speak, as the new year, 1786, dawns there in our pioneer past.